The rain fell in a steady rhythm outside, an unbroken cascade that muffled the sounds of the world beyond Sarah's quiet suburban street. It was the kind of night she usually found soothing, one of those rare moments when the noise of life softened into a gentle hum, and the steady drip of water lulled her into a peaceful calm. But not tonight. Tonight the rain felt different, sharp and cold, like an intruder. And something else was out there too, something she couldn't quite put into words. Sarah sat in her living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. She flipped absent-mindedly through a magazine she had no interest in, trying to push aside the uncomfortable tension that had been growing since sundown. She could feel it lingering just beyond her door, creeping closer with every passing minute. She glanced over at the front door for what felt like the 100th time. The thick wooden barrier stood between her and the outside world, a sturdy shield that had always brought her comfort. But now it felt fragile, vulnerable. Sarah shook her head, trying to dismiss the irrational thoughts. It was just a quiet night in the suburbs. There was nothing to be afraid of. The air in the room seemed heavier, though, pressing down on her chest. She adjusted her position on the couch, but the feeling only intensified. It wasn't just the weather making her uneasy. It was something deeper, something off. She kept seeing things out of the corner of her eye, fleeting movements in the shadows. First, it was a slight blur across the window. Then the sound of a creak upstairs, even though she knew no one was there. But it was the tapping that started to drive her mad. At first, she thought it was just the wind blowing the branches against the house. The rhythmic sound was easy to ignore, like the rain, and she told herself not to pay it any mind. But it grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't a natural noise, it had purpose behind it, like someone testing the boundaries of her patience, waiting to see when she would finally notice. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart rate quickened and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. Sarah leaned forward, squinting at the window, but the rain made it impossible to see beyond the glass. She reached for her phone, desperate for a distraction. The familiar screen lit up, and there was a message from her best friend, Emily. "Hey, heard there's a storm rolling in. You all right? Need me to come over?" Sarah's fingers moved swiftly over the keyboard. "I'm fine. Just a little creeped out for no reason, LOL. The rain's getting to me, I guess." She hesitated, considering adding more, then quickly hit send before she could overthink it. Emily had a way of calming her down, grounding her when her mind started to run wild. Her phone buzzed with Emily's response almost instantly. "Well, you're probably just tired. Just make sure you lock the doors and get some rest. Let me know if you need anything." Sarah smiled faintly at the screen and nodded to herself. That was all it was, just exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. She was safe here, inside her own home. She set the phone down and leaned back into the couch cushions, forcing herself to relax. Then came the knock. It was so sudden, so loud in the quiet of the room, that Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She sat up straight, her body rigid with tension. She blinked, straining her ears to listen for any follow-up noise. At first, there was nothing. Only the sound of rain pattering against the window again. She almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. But just as her body began to unwind, it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She froze, every muscle in her body screaming for her to move, to do something, anything, but all she could do was stare at the door. The knocks were deliberate, forceful, but controlled, as if whoever stood on the other side knew exactly how much pressure to apply to make it unsettling. She stood slowly, legs trembling beneath her. She moved toward the door, the sense of dread swelling inside her. The thought occurred to her that she could call Emily back, tell her to come over after all. But Sarah's pride wouldn't let her. She was an adult. She wasn't afraid of the dark, wasn't afraid of the rain, and she certainly wasn't afraid of an empty house. She took a deep breath and stepped closer, her bare feet making soft sounds on the hardwood floor. When she reached the door, she hesitated for just a moment before pressing her eye to the peephole. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she squinted into the small glass lens. Nothing. Outside, there was only darkness, the rain slashing sideways across her front yard. No shapes, no shadows, no person waiting to be let in. For a moment, relief washed over her. It was just her imagination playing cruel tricks again. But then, as she prepared to step back, she heard it. A voice, soft but clear, just outside her door. "Sarah, let me in." She gasped, stumbling back from the door as if she had been struck. The voice was familiar, far too familiar. It sounded just like Emily. But it couldn't be Emily. Emily wouldn't come over in the middle of a storm without calling first. Would she? Sarah's breath came fast and shallow. She reached for her phone again, her hands shaking as she scrolled through her messages. She pulled up Emily's text, staring at the words as if they would give her some kind of clue. The storm raged louder outside, and the knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Sarah, it's cold out here. Let me in." The voice was a perfect imitation, every note of Emily's tone replicated with eerie precision. But it wasn't Emily. Sarah took another step back, her pulse racing. The dread now consumed her, sinking deep into her bones. She glanced back at the door, half expecting it to fly open on its own. She didn't move any closer this time. Something was very wrong, and she knew, with every instinct in her body, that she couldn't open that door. The voice outside persisted, more demanding now. "Sarah, why are you doing this? It's me. It's Emily. Let me in." She shut her eyes tight, trying to block out the sound, trying to convince herself that this was all some bizarre nightmare. But when she opened her eyes, she was still standing in her living room, still staring at the door, and the knocking hadn't stopped. Something was outside, something that knew her, something that wanted to be let in, and she knew, with growing terror, that if she opened that door, even a crack, she would never be safe again. Sarah backed away, heart pounding in her throat, until she bumped into the wall behind her. She slid down to the floor, hugging her knees to her chest, waiting for the knocking to stop, praying that whatever was out there would go away. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't. It was patient. It would wait as long as it needed to, and it would return. The morning light crept slowly into the room, filtering through the blinds in slivers of pale gold. For Sarah, the new day brought little comfort. She had barely slept, her mind a whirlpool of questions and rising terror. The knocking, the voice, they were still fresh in her memory, replaying in a loop that gnawed at her sanity. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous night in her mind. Her whole body felt heavy, as if weighed down by an invisible force she couldn't shake. The thought crossed her mind. Maybe it had been a dream, a twisted, vivid nightmare. Maybe her exhaustion had finally caught up with her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. The sound of that voice, the way it had mirrored Emily's so perfectly, still lingered in her ears. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. Dragging herself out of bed, she padded to the kitchen, trying to push the thoughts aside. She brewed herself a cup of coffee, the familiar motions providing a small sense of control. As she sipped the bitter liquid, she felt a little more grounded, a little more in control of her own mind. She would call Emily, she decided, just to confirm that everything was okay, that she hadn't really been outside her door in the middle of the night. Sarah's fingers hovered over her phone, hesitant. What if Emily didn't answer? Or worse, what if she did? She shook her head. She was being ridiculous. She needed answers, and sitting here in silence would only drive her deeper into the madness she was desperately trying to avoid. The phone rang twice before Emily's voice came through the line, chipper as always. "Hey, stranger, you alive over there?" Sarah nearly laughed, the normalcy of Emily's voice a soothing balm for her frayed nerves. She closed her eyes, trying to let herself believe that everything was fine. "Yeah, I'm alive," Sarah replied, forcing a lightness into her tone. "Sorry for being weird last night. I was just having a rough night." Emily made a sympathetic noise. "No worries, bad dreams. Or was it the storm? It was pretty crazy out there." "Something like that," Sarah murmured, hesitating. You didn't stop by last night, did you?" Emily laughed, the sound ringing through the phone like music. "No way. I was in bed binge-watching some terrible reality show. Why? Did something happen?" Sarah's stomach twisted at the answer. She had known Emily would say that, had known it wasn't really her friend outside the door last night, but hearing it confirmed sent a chill through her bones. "No, nothing happened," she lied quickly, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I just thought I heard something, that's all. Must have been the wind." Emily laughed again, oblivious to the tension in Sarah's voice. "Probably. Anyway, let's do something this weekend, okay? Get out of the house, take your mind off things." The knocking had been real. The voice had been real. She knew that now, even if she didn't want to admit it. It wasn't Emily outside her door, but something else. Something that had learned how to mimic her friend's voice. Something that wanted to get inside. She moved through the rest of the day like a ghost, going through the motions but never quite shaking the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound in the house sharper. By the time evening rolled around, the unease had fully taken root inside her, blossoming into a gnawing dread that refused to leave her alone. As she sat on the couch that evening, staring at the front door, she couldn't help but remember the stories her grandmother used to tell her when she was a little girl. Sarah had grown up with those stories, old tales of spirits and creatures that lurked in the dark, waiting for the chance to slip into the homes of the unsuspecting. Most of them had faded from her memory over the years, relegated to the status of childish superstition. But one of those stories clawed its way back into her mind now, sharp and vivid. Her grandmother had called it the Nameless Woman. Sarah could almost hear her grandmother's raspy voice now, telling her the tale in a low whisper, meant to frighten and caution. The Nameless Woman comes at night when the house is quiet and everyone's asleep. She knocks at the door and calls out in the voice of someone you know. She sounds just like them, down to the very last word. You'll be tempted to let her in. You'll believe she's your mother or your sister or your best friend. But she isn't. She's something else, something ancient, and once you let her in, she never leaves." Sarah had laughed at those stories as a child, finding them nothing more than silly folklore. But now, in the stillness of her home, with that knocking fresh in her mind, the story felt less like a fable and more like a warning. She shook her head. No, that was ridiculous. The nameless woman was just a story. There were no malevolent spirits trying to trick her into opening her door. That was just fear talking, fear and exhaustion. But even as she tried to dismiss the thought, the dread lingered. She couldn't deny the familiarity of the voice that had called her name. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been outside last night would come again. And when it did, what would she do? Would she open the door? That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was once again bathed in shadows, Sarah felt the tension begin to build again. She locked the doors, checked the windows, made sure everything was sealed tight. She moved through the house with a sense of ritual, every click of a lock, a temporary reprieve from the growing fear inside her. But when she sat down on the couch, she couldn't relax. Her eyes kept drifting toward the front door, her ears straining for any sound beyond the rain. It was almost midnight when the knocking started again. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The sound was soft at first, almost polite. 3 short raps against the wood. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing it to go away. But then came the voice, soft and pleading. "Sarah, let me in. It's me." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice was identical to Emily's, but there was something wrong with it, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. It was too perfect, too rehearsed, like a recording played on loop, meant to lure her closer. She forced herself to stand, though her legs trembled beneath her. Slowly, cautiously, she made her way to the door. The voice called out again, more insistent this time. "Sarah, please, why won't you let me in?" It was Emily's voice. Every inflection, every pause was exactly the way her friend would speak. But this wasn't Emily. She knew that now. She had known it the night before, but hearing it again, feeling the pressure of that presence just on the other side of the door, made her certain. This was no coincidence, no trick of the mind. It was something else, something that had been watching her for longer than she realized. Her grandmother's stories echoed in her head, warning her to stay strong, to resist the urge to open the door. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms as she backed away, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Sarah," the voice cried, sharper now, almost angry. "Don't you trust me? I'm your friend." The words scraped against her nerves, sending a shiver through her entire body. She stumbled backward, away from the door, away from the thing that waited on the other side. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't open the door. She couldn't. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. But the fear didn't leave. It lingered, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. She collapsed onto the floor, shaking, her mind spiraling into panic. The house was quiet again, but she knew it wouldn't last. It would come back. It would knock again, whisper again, and each time it did, it would wear down her resolve just a little bit more. And the terrifying part was that Sarah didn't know how much longer she could hold out. The days began to blur together, each one identical to the last, marked by a routine that Sarah clung to like a lifeline. She would wake up in the morning, bathed in the cold light of dawn, and pretend that everything was normal. She would drink her coffee, force herself to eat something, and try to occupy her mind with small tasks around the house. But the sense of dread never left her. It hovered at the edge of her consciousness, a shadow she could never quite shake. The nights were worse. That was when the house seemed to change. Its familiar walls warped into something strange and hostile. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside sent a jolt of panic through her. And always, always, there was the waiting for the knock, for the voice to return. It had been almost a week since the first time it happened, and Sarah had begun to feel the wear of the constant fear. She barely slept anymore, too afraid of what might happen if she let herself drift off. When she did manage to close her eyes, her dreams were filled with shadowy figures, knocking, always knocking, and voices whispering her name in the dark. Even in sleep, there was no escape. She stopped going outside. She stopped answering her phone. Emily had called several times, left voicemails that grew increasingly concerned, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to listen to them. What would she even say? That something had been mimicking her voice, trying to get into the house? That she was slowly unraveling? No, Emily wouldn't believe her. No one would. The isolation was suffocating, but it was safer this way. Sarah knew that if she let anyone get too close, if she let anyone inside, it would only make it easier for it to slip through the cracks. Whatever it was. Her thoughts spiraled as she tried to make sense of it all, but there was no sense to be found. Only fear, only darkness. The knocking continued each night, growing louder and more insistent with every passing evening. The voice, Emily's voice, became more desperate, pleading with her, calling her name over and over. The worst part was that it was getting harder to resist. Each night it sounded more convincing, more real, as if Emily were truly standing out there in the rain, begging to be let inside. Sarah had started to second-guess herself. What if it really was her friend in trouble, in need? What if she had been wrong this whole time? She couldn't allow herself to think like that. The thing outside wasn't Emily. She had to hold on to that. It wasn't Emily. But doubt had already taken root, and it began to eat away at her. Her mind played tricks on her. She would see things out of the corner of her eye, fleeting shadows moving just beyond her field of vision. Objects weren't where she remembered putting them. Doors she had locked were mysteriously left ajar. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear faint footsteps upstairs, even though she knew she was alone. Her house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a prison, filled with invisible eyes watching her every move. And no matter how hard she tried to calm herself, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was no longer in control of her own mind. She began to avoid the mirrors. There was something wrong with her reflection. At first, it was subtle, a slight delay between her movements and the image she saw, but as the days wore on, it became more pronounced. Her reflection didn't always follow her lead. Sometimes it would linger for a beat too long, staring back at her with a strange expression she didn't recognize as her own. On one occasion, she caught a glimpse of herself smiling in the mirror, even though her lips hadn't moved. The first time it happened, she screamed and hurled the mirror across the room, watching in horrified fascination as it shattered against the wall, the glass fracturing into 100 tiny shards that littered the floor like jagged stars. She stood there for a long time, staring at the mess, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The silence that followed was almost worse than the scream that had preceded it. She couldn't deny it anymore. Something was inside her house. Maybe it had been there all along, lurking just out of sight, waiting for her to break. Or maybe it had slipped in without her knowing, worming its way into her thoughts, her mind. Was that what it wanted all along? Not to break into her home, but to break into her. The realization terrified her. If it had already gotten inside her head, how much of what she was experiencing was real? What if the knocking had never happened? What if the voice outside had been nothing more than a hallucination, a trick of her paranoid mind? She began to question everything. When she heard the knocking that night, she didn't run to the door in terror. Instead, she sat on the floor, knees drawn up to her chest, trying to block it out. She couldn't trust her own senses anymore. The world had become a distorted reflection of itself, and she was trapped inside it. That night, the voice was different. It no longer sounded like Emily. It had twisted into something darker, deeper, almost unrecognizable. But it still called her name, still pleaded with her to open the door. "Sarah, let me in, please. I'm worried about you." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice still mimicked concern, but there was a coldness behind the words now, a hidden threat that made her blood run cold. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms until they left half-moon indentations in her skin. "You have to let me in, Sarah," the voice continued. "You can't stay in there forever. I'm the only one who can help you." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. But the knocking grew louder, more forceful, and with each knock her resolve began to crack. She felt the weight of the presence pressing against her door, felt its pull in her mind, trying to drag her closer. "Why are you doing this?" the voice hissed, its tone turning sharp. "You know who I am. You've always known." Sarah whimpered, curling tighter into herself. It wasn't true. It couldn't be true. But doubt gnawed at her, sinking its teeth in deeper, whispering insidiously that maybe she did know. Maybe she had known all along. It was getting harder to remember what was real. She thought back to her childhood, to her grandmother's stories. The nameless woman, a creature that took the form of those you loved, wearing their faces, their voices, until you couldn't tell the difference between the real and the false. It slipped into your life, your mind, until it consumed you. But those were just stories, weren't they? Old tales meant to frighten children. They weren't real, except that they were real. Sarah could feel it in her bones. The nameless woman wasn't just some story. It was here, now, inside her home, inside her head. She had invited it in long ago without even realizing it. She glanced at the door, trembling. It was so tempting to open it, to give in and let it all end. The fear, the confusion, the constant uncertainty. It would be so much easier to just surrender. Maybe then she could rest. Maybe then the knocking would stop. But something deep inside her refused to give in. She still had a sliver of hope, a thin thread that kept her tethered to reality. If she opened that door, if she let it inside, she knew she would be lost forever. There would be no coming back. The knocking continued, relentless. The voice grew more distorted, more urgent, but Sarah didn't move. She stayed curled up on the floor, her body shaking with the effort of holding herself together. And then, finally, after what felt like hours, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. It hung in the air, thick and oppressive, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. She didn't trust it. She knew it was still there, waiting, biding its time. But for now it was quiet. Sarah slowly uncurled herself, her muscles stiff and aching. She didn't dare look at the door. Instead, she stared at the broken shards of the mirror on the floor, her fractured reflection staring back at her from 100 different angles. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. The house was quiet, but Sarah knew better than to believe the silence. It was just the calm before the storm. The knocking would come again, the voice would return, and the next time it did, she wasn't sure she'd be strong enough to resist. The line between reality and nightmare was growing thinner by the day, and soon, she feared, it would disappear altogether. Sarah stood in front of the door, bathed in the dim glow of the hallway light. Her entire body trembled, but she wasn't sure if it was from fear or exhaustion anymore. She had reached a breaking point. Days had melted into nights, and her mind had long since lost track of where one ended and the other began. Her thoughts felt fractured, pieces of herself scattered and slipping away like grains of sand through her fingers. But tonight, she felt a strange calm settle over her. It was almost peaceful in its finality. The rain outside had stopped. The wind had died down. The house, which had once creaked and groaned under the pressure of a storm that mirrored the chaos inside her, was now eerily still. Only the sound of her own heartbeat filled the silence, thudding in her chest, a rhythm she no longer trusted. It was almost midnight. She knew the knocking would come soon. She knew the voice, her voice, would follow. It always did. Every night, without fail, it had grown so familiar now that a part of her almost welcomed it. There was something comforting in the repetition, in the predictability of the nightmare. But tonight was different. Tonight, Sarah had made a decision. She was done hiding, done running. The fear had gnawed at her for so long that she was hollow inside. She was a shell of the person she had once been, barely able to recognize herself in the reflections she had so carefully avoided. She glanced at the shattered mirror shards that still littered the floor from that night. How long ago was it now? Days? Weeks? It didn't matter. Time had lost its meaning. All that mattered was what was about to happen. The knock came. It was soft at first, tentative, like a lover's gentle tap on the door after an argument. 3 deliberate raps, then silence. Sarah exhaled slowly. Her breath felt foreign to her, like it didn't belong to the body it came from. She stepped forward. Her feet were bare, and she felt the cold seep through the floorboards, creeping up her legs like icy fingers. It grounded her, kept her tethered to this reality that was slipping further away each day. One more step, then another. She moved slowly, deliberately, until she was standing in front of the door. Sarah. The voice was calm now, patient. It no longer mimicked Emily perfectly. Instead, it was something else, something older, deeper, richer. It was both soothing and terrifying in its familiarity. You fought so hard, you must be so tired. She was tired. More tired than she had ever been in her life. Her bones ached with it. Her mind ached with it. She had spent every night for what felt like an eternity holding out, resisting the pull of that voice, the allure of letting go. But tonight, she wasn't sure she had anything left to fight with. "I know you're scared," the voice continued, soft and coaxing. "But you don't have to be. Not anymore. I can make it all go away. The fear, the loneliness, the pain." Sarah's hand hovered over the lock. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the cold metal, and she felt that presence just on the other side of the door, waiting so patiently for her to open it. The promises it made were sweet, so sweet. The relief it offered was tempting, intoxicating. She could be free. Free from the endless nights of terror, free from the uncertainty that plagued her every thought. All she had to do was turn the lock. One simple action. That was all it would take. "Just let me in, Sarah," the voice whispered. It was closer now, like it was pressing its lips to the crack of the door, like it could feel the heat of her breath through the wood. "I've been waiting for you. I've always been waiting for you." Her pulse quickened. Her hand hovered, frozen, as her mind whirled in 1,000 directions. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to give in, to let go of the burden of always being on guard, of always living in fear. And yet, something held her back. Some small, fragile part of her that still remembered who she was, who she used to be. That part of her whispered one last warning, faint but insistent. This was the final choice. Once she opened the door, there was no turning back. She blinked hard, trying to clear her thoughts, but the voice was inside her now, coiling around her mind like a snake, tightening its grip. It was impossible to tell where her own thoughts ended and its influence began. "You've done so well, Sarah, but you don't have to carry this burden any longer. You can let go now. Let me in." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. She wanted to let go. She wanted to stop fighting. But a part of her knew, deep down, that this wasn't salvation. It was surrender. The knob felt cold and solid under her hand. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tight with the weight of the decision before her. She could feel the presence on the other side of the door, so close now that it almost felt like a part of her, as if the door itself was alive and pulsing with that same dark energy. "Please," the voice whispered again, its tone shifting. There was something darker beneath it now, something dangerous. "You know it's me. You know who I am. You've always known." And Sarah did know. She had known it from the moment she heard the first knock, from the moment she heard her name spoken in that false, familiar voice. This thing, it wasn't just trying to get into her house. It had already gotten into her mind, had sunk its claws into her thoughts, her memories. It had always been there, lurking in the shadows of her life, waiting for this moment. "Let me in." The words were soft now, almost tender, but they carried with them the weight of inevitability. Sarah's hand shook as she gripped the door, the tension building, the decision hanging in the air like a blade about to drop. And then, in a single fluid motion, she did it. She turned the lock. The sound of the latch clicking open was louder than she expected, deafening in the silence of the house. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a deep breath, bracing herself for what was to come. She opened the door just a crack. The cold air from outside rushed in, and Sarah's breath hitched as she peered through the small gap, her eyes widening in terror. There was nothing there, no figure, no shadow, no familiar face waiting on the doorstep, only darkness, only emptiness. But she could feel it, the presence, the weight of it, pressing against her, pressing into her. It didn't need a physical form. It was already inside, had been inside her for longer than she had realized. She hadn't let it in just now. No, she had let it in long ago, and now it was simply making itself known. Sarah gasped, stumbling back, but it was too late. The door swung open wide, and the darkness rushed in. It wasn't like the shadows of night or the simple absence of light. It was alive, pulsing with a life of its own, a deep, oppressive void that swallowed everything in its path. It flooded into the house, into her, wrapping itself around her like a shroud. The voice, no longer outside, whispered in her ear, "Thank you." The words were gentle, almost affectionate, but they held a finality that chilled her to the core. She had given in, she had let it inside, and now there was no going back. The darkness enveloped her, seeping into her skin, her bones, her mind. Sarah felt herself slipping away, her thoughts dissolving into the void. She tried to hold on, to cling to whatever small part of herself remained, but it was no use. The darkness was too strong. And then there was nothing. Just silence. Just darkness. And then the house was still again. Outside, the storm began to pick up once more, rain falling in heavy sheets, wind howling through the night. The door, left slightly ajar, creaked on its hinges, moving gently with the gusts of wind. And then, softly, ever so softly, a knock.